All right. So today here on the Newport This Week podcast, we're talking about something that is a profound issue for the city of Newport right now. And it has been for several years. And that's short-term rentals. Reading from Newport This Week, an article you can find in the paper right now, short-term rental fees up to $1,000 in Newport. I'll just briefly read the beginning of this article. The annual fee to register a property as a short-term rental in Newport is increasing after a recent city council vote, but the amount of the price hike will depend on the nature of the property. On June 14th, the council approved increasing the registration fee to $500 per year for owner-occupied short-term rental properties and $1,000 a year for non-owner-occupied properties. Previously, all short-term rentals in the city paid $100 annual fee, which in and of itself, when you think about the business model, is a little bit shocking. Joining us this week is Billington Hunt, who has been serving on the ad hoc tax committee, someone who has a lot of knowledge on the short-term rental issue and its implications. Good morning, Penny, and thanks for making the time.
Good morning, Bill. Thanks for having me. I'm glad to be here.
A pleasure. So in addition to that municipal regulation, if you will, that has come forth in recent times, there's also been some statewide legislation that has made its way through. That is all in league with really just a sentiment more than anything that the Airbnb, Verbo, short-term rentals in a place, especially like Newport, and we're also seeing it in Middletown, of course, it's something that's got to get tackled because it's changing the landscape of the city. Talk about your experience in addressing this topic.
Sure. So one of the challenges in this topic is that the terminology is really all over the map. And unfortunately, I think that confuses a lot of residents and honestly can be confusing to our policymakers, to the council, when they're trying to have a discussion about the best approach on new policy here. There has been some chipping away at this issue, I guess I'll call it, really one update per year that I can walk us through if we have time, some of which you mentioned, and the latest of which is this increase to the registration fee. But just going back to the terminology issue, I'll turn the tables on you for a second, Bill. What do you think short-term rental means?
Well, I think we've learned that it means anything that is a property where someone on basically a commercial level is renting out either a room, an apartment, or an entire home, or quite frankly, an entire complex for somebody who is a guest staying, I would say, no more than a month.
Okay, well, you got the time frame right. So the fewer than 30 days is what we are technically talking about with short-term rental at this point in the city of Newport. The second layer that is confusing for folks and really was at the crux of the council discussion last week around the registration fee is that there's a significant portion in Newport that are what they're now calling owner-occupied short-term rental. So folks renting up to 2 bedrooms within their home, as compared to what you were describing, which I call investment short-term rental, where folks have, purchased the property or inherited the property in its entirety and are using that to rent out as a whole unit, an apartment unit or a whole house, right? And so in watching this issue, I've been watching it since about 2021. At that time, the update was changing the zoning rules to eliminate the possibility of getting a permit to do a short-term rental whole unit in a residential zone. So sort of the headline at the time was short-term rentals banned in residential zones, but again, the devil is really in the details on these definitions. So at the outset, I just really keep trying to push the city to provide more transparent data around these different segments. So the recent list based on this year's registration has about 310 registrants. They're still going through actually issuing the permits to all those who have applied for the current year. But in that list is, as I mentioned, a good amount of folks who are just doing this within their own home on a limited basis. But then there's the investment short-term rental. And then actually I need to note that list, that number actually also includes significant sized hotels. So that goes to the difficulties and problems we've seen with the data in defining what is really a short-term rental and getting these numbers right. So I just really hope the policymakers will continue to dig in and get that information more transparent and more accurate to understand what we're talking about here.
Yeah. And in addition to just that transparency, which I agree is quite critical to assessing this issue at any reasonable or I guess productive level, there's also been an issue that has been pretty consistent of a lack of teeth when it comes to enforcement. Who really is the regulatory body here? Is it really a commercially regulated business? Is it something that is more of a, hey, we have a special municipal enforcer, or like, how does this all get enforced? And that registration process is just part of that. What's your take on sort of the overall system in terms of from registration through enforcement of the variety of different ordinances surrounding short-term rentals?
It has been a mixed bag, I guess I would say, with regard to these approaches, because there's a number of considerations. So the state legislation that passed out last year requiring short-term rentals across the state to register is also closely related to the issue of collecting taxes appropriately. So I think that is an appropriate move with regard to the revenue collection. Unfortunately, and with all due respect to the legislative body that, promoted that and passed it, because it is a needed step. What I'm seeing right now on the lists is a bit of increased confusion, another layer of confusion. So I already talked about how within the existing registration at the city level, we have different segments. Now, actually, folks seem to be registering at the state and perhaps thinking that supersedes a city registration. I've seen properties on the state list, too, just in my neighborhood here, immediate neighborhood, that are actually doing a monthly rental, but registered at the state level. So right now, unfortunately, it's just adding to the level of confusion where they have 510 properties registered at the state. And, as I mentioned, 310 in Newport. And so I know the city is working toward figuring that out. But these types of issues just really erode the resident confidence in this process. And I think that's just important toward community building and feeling as though what those of us who are year-round residents envision for the community is important, that our concerns are being heard and that we have a level of confidence in the enforcement piece as well. As you mentioned, on the enforcement, I will say the other steps that have been taken in these 3 years, changing again where you could do this in residential zones previously and you just can't at all, increasing the fee this year, and then last year requiring the registration at the state level. None of those have really gone to the enforcement side of it. And so I do share that concern that there's really no data aggregation on the back end. Properties are cited and brought to municipal court if they would like to contest the fee that they're assessed, or the fine rather, in the case of a violation. But even as someone who's been looking at this for 2 years, I'm unaware of any aggregate information about enforcement and really whether that's meaningful. Even if they are cited and, identified and properly cited, is that really effective?
Right. Really, really interesting stuff there. Sort of our last area here, and I guess it's such a vague, well, put it this way, it's such a big issue that we could probably do this for another 2 hours and still leave this question unresolved, but it's a basic one. What's the next step for short-term rentals in Newport? Realistically, for the person out there that's watching this, listening to this, reading the article in Newport this week and wondering, where is this trending? Where is this going? Is this going to be something that from your experience, in your opinion, I suppose, will likely be resolved, or are we still a long way from getting to a point where we can sort of restore the balance, the organic nature of Newport? Because look, Newport's had short-term rentals forever, regular quote unquote B&Bs, hotels, obviously, and even the informal short-term, rent a room for the summer type of thing for some of the sailing community or other people who come in for on a seasonal basis. That's been there. It's really just the industry of short-term rentals that has exploded. What's your take? Where's this going to resolve itself?
Sure. And I think we can all appreciate the long history of hosting in Newport. And as you mentioned, on different levels, and, at risk of sounding like a conspiracy theorist, the internet is sort of to blame for accelerating the rate of this phenomenon as an investment opportunity and all of those things that we feel as residents of Newport. But I think the Pandora's box that I'll open just a little crack is when you ask, where are we going or what's next, is to also be aware that it's not just about the rentals under 30 days, right? And obviously the city has to create the structures that identify properties in different categories, but there is a significant, again, lack of data around how many properties are being used for seasonal rental. And so, again, trying to support year-round residency, both for rental properties and for home owner-occupied properties, as was achieved with the property tax program that does allow for year-round rental to be eligible for the low rate. Do we really have our hands around the whole issue? Because allowing monthly rentals by right throughout the city, that is becoming increasingly popular in the residential neighborhoods. As you mentioned, that's always been the case, downtown, folks signing on many leases, many people on a lease for the summer and coming and going. But that month standard, is that too much of a loophole? And it would really give the residents a sense of confidence if we could at least say, this is how many properties there are that are used for seasonal rental, which the focus on that listing has diminished in the shadow of the fewer than 30-day phenomenon. And so the city is supposed to be collecting registration for any property that's rented for fewer than 9 months. And that has gone a bit by the wayside. That listing is even less updated. So there's kind of, as I mentioned, a Pandora's box there to open and say, really, what is the total use of properties in Newport and what's going on? How many do we have residing year-round residency?
One of the critical issues of our time, no doubt, is housing. The short-term rental component of that is a major one. It's terra incognito in a lot of ways, and you're doing great work to assess this and keep the pedal down on trying to get this, frankly, in short, just organized in a way that seems more equitable for everybody involved. Penny Billington Hunt, thanks so much for your time this morning on the Newport This Week podcast.
Thanks, Bill. Look forward to keeping in touch.
Likewise.